One shot, one man, one moment was all it took to set the world on fire. In a quiet city called Sarajevo, a 19-year-old pulled the trigger, and suddenly the world's greatest empires began to fall like dominoes. This wasn't just a war, it was the birth of modern warfare. With machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and millions of young men buried in foreign soil, cities were flattened, families torn apart, kings lost crowns, new nations were born, and the world would never return to what it once was. This day is the true story of World War I, the war that was meant to end all wars. Chapter 1. A ticking time bomb. Europe. Before 1914. Before the war, there was peace, at least on the surface. In 1914, Europe looked strong, civilized, and confident. People dressed well, cities were busy, railways connected nations, art, science, and technology were booming. It felt like the future was bright. But beneath all that progress, something dangerous was building. Europe was like a room filled with dry gunpowder. One spark, just one, and everything would explode. So how did it get this way? Let's go back. By the early 1900s, Europe was divided into powerful empires. There was the British Empire, huge, wealthy, ruling over territories across Africa, Asia, and beyond. Then came France, proud and still licking its wounds from a war lost decades earlier. Germany was young, aggressive, and growing fast. Austria-Hungary was old, fragile, and full of internal cracks. Russia was vast but slow, still ruled by a czar who believed in absolute power. And then there was Italy, ambitious but unstable. Each of these nations had their own goals, their own fears, their own pride, and all of them wanted more land, more power, more respect. This hunger led to what's called imperialism, the idea that a country should grow its power by controlling others. That's why Britain and France had been racing around the world grabbing colonies. Germany, newer to the game, felt left out. It wanted its place in the sun, and fast. Tension grew as the great powers competed over Africa, Asia, and even the Balkans. But imperialism wasn't the only fuel for war. There was nationalism, a deep belief that one's country was better than all the others. In Germany, it took the form of pride in the military and the Kaiser. In France, it was tied to memories of glory and revenge. In Russia, it meant protecting all Slavic people, especially those under foreign rule. And in smaller nations like Serbia, nationalism became something explosive, a dream of independence from bigger empires. Inside Austria-Hungary, nationalism was a ticking bomb. This empire wasn't one people. It was many. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, Poles, and more. They spoke different languages, followed different religions, and didn't always feel loyal to Vienna. The empire tried to hold itself together, but cracks were everywhere. To protect themselves, the major powers formed alliances, like cliques in a schoolyard, but with weapons. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other side, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. These weren't casual friendships, they were military promises. If someone attacks you, we've got your back. These deals were supposed to keep the peace, to make everyone think twice before starting a war. But they also meant that if one country went to war, others would be pulled in like dominoes. It didn't help that everyone was preparing for war, even before it started. In the years before 1914, European nations were locked in an arms race. Germany and Britain were building massive navies, especially dreadnought battleships. France and Germany were pouring money into new rifles, artillery, and ammunition. Military leaders were drawing up war plans in secret. Everyone believed that if war came, it would be short, heroic, and glorious. That was the fantasy. Generals in Germany had a plan called the Schlieffen Plan. It was like a giant domino move. Knock France out quickly, then rush east to fight Russia. They believed speed and surprise were everything. Russia, meanwhile, was modernizing its army. France was building defenses and training new soldiers. Britain focused on its navy, confident that it could control the seas. And Austria-Hungary? It relied heavily on Germany and hoped its empire wouldn't fall apart before it won anything. But war wasn't just about countries and borders. It was also about people and how they felt. In cafes and newspapers, people talked about patriotism, about honor, about dying for the flag. Young men believed war would make them heroes, that they'd come home with medals and stories. Few imagined they'd die in muddy trenches or be crushed by machines they didn't understand. And in the Balkans, that messy, unstable region in southeastern Europe, those feelings were even more dangerous. The Balkans had long been called the powder keg of Europe, and for good reason. The Ottoman Empire, once powerful in the region, was now weak. New countries like Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania were trying to expand. Nationalist groups wanted independence. Others wanted revenge. Austria-Hungary had taken control of Bosnia in 1908, angering Serbia and many Bosnian Serbs. Tensions were boiling. Some of these tensions exploded early. In 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars broke out. Countries in the region fought over land and power. Borders shifted. Thousands died. And Europe watched nervously, wondering if something bigger was coming. Back in Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the loud, proud emperor, wanted his empire to shine. He wore military uniforms, gave fiery speeches, and believed Germany was destined for greatness. He didn't trust Britain. He looked down on Russia, and he supported Austria-Hungary, even when it made risky moves. Under his rule, Germany grew, more aggressive, more isolated, and more feared. France, still haunted by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, wanted revenge, especially for Alsace and Lorraine, the territories it had lost to Germany. French leaders knew that if war came, they needed allies. That's why they strengthened ties with Russia and later Britain. Britain, meanwhile, had kept its distance from Europe's troubles for a long time. It was focused on its navy, its empire, and staying strong at home. But as Germany's navy grew and tensions in Europe escalated, Britain began to worry. It didn't want to be pulled into a war, but it also didn't want to be left alone if one started. And Russia, massive, old-fashioned, and slow, was struggling to modernize. It had lost a war to Japan in 1905, shaking its confidence. It feared Germany and Austria-Hungary, but it saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations, especially Serbia. That made it a natural enemy of Austria-Hungary and a close friend to the Serbs. So by 1914 the pieces were set. The great powers of Europe were armed, anxious, and ready. Alliances tied them together like ropes. Nationalism pushed people to take risks. Imperialism made every part of the world a possible battlefield, and in the Balkans, especially in Serbia and Bosnia, angry young men were dreaming of action. Some leaders believed war would unite their people. Some thought they could win quickly. Most didn't realize how deadly it would become. It was only a matter of time. Then came the moment. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo. He was there to show strength, to remind the people that the empire was still in control. But not everyone welcomed him. A group of young Bosnian Serbs, angry about Austrian rule, had a plan. They wanted to send a message, a deadly one. One of them was a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. And as the Archduke's car turned down the wrong street, he was standing there with a gun, 2 shots, that was all. Franz Ferdinand was dead. His wife Sophie was dead. The empire was in shock. At first it seemed like a local tragedy, a royal assassination in a troubled part of the empire. But within weeks, that moment would pull all of Europe into war. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Serbia denied it. Russia stood behind Serbia. Germany stood behind Austria-Hungary. France backed Russia. Britain waited. Letters were sent. Ultimatums were given. Secrets were shared. And in the shadows, war plans were unfolding. The fuse had been lit. The powder keg was about to blow. And Europe, once proud, rich, and full of promise, was about to enter the bloodiest war it had ever known. Chapter 2. The Spark. Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was a sunny Sunday morning. June 28, 1914. A date that would change the course of history. The streets of Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia, were crowded with excitement. People, lined the roads to see a royal procession. Flags waved, music played. Soldiers stood in their polished uniforms. In an open-top car rode Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie. It was their wedding anniversary. They had come to Sarajevo for a goodwill visit, to show the empire's strength and calm the tension in the region. But beneath the surface, something far darker was brewing. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908. That angered many Serbs and Bosnian Slavs who wanted to be free, to join with Serbia and form their own Slavic nation. To them, Austria-Hungary was not a rightful ruler. It was an oppressor. And now the Archduke, symbol of the empire, was parading through their streets. In the crowd were 7 young men, members of a secret nationalist group called the Black Hand. They believed violence was the only way to achieve independence. They had trained, smuggled weapons across the border, and waited for this very day. Each of them had a pistol, a bomb, and a vial of poison. They were ready to kill or die. As the Archduke's motorcade rolled through Sarajevo's narrow streets, the first assassin saw the car and froze, too scared to act. The next threw a bomb, but it bounced off the car's folded roof and exploded under another vehicle, injuring bystanders and officers. Chaos erupted. The Archduke was rushed away, the assassins scattered. One tried to swallow his poison and jump into the river, but both failed. He was caught and beaten by an angry mob before police dragged him away. Everyone thought it was over, a failed attempt, a lucky escape. But the day wasn't done. Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing his visit. He wanted to go to the hospital and see the people injured by the blast. His wife insisted on staying by his side. They climbed into their car, same driver, same route, unaware that a mistake was about to change history. The driver took a wrong turn. As the car tried to back up, it stopped right in front of a small cafe, and standing there by pure chance was Gavrilo Princip, just 19 years old, pale, thin, and sickly. He had come to kill the Archduke that morning. After the failed attempt, he thought it was over. He went to get a sandwich, and now, by fate or accident, the target was right in front of him. He stepped forward, pulled out his pistol, and fired 2 shots. The first hit Sophie in the stomach. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. She died almost instantly. He collapsed, blood pouring from his mouth, whispering her name. Moments later, the car sped off. But it was too late. The future emperor of Austria-Hungary was dead. His wife, a woman many considered unfit for royalty, had died by his side. The news spread quickly, across Sarajevo, across the empire, across the continent. At first, many people didn't understand the weight of it. Political assassinations weren't rare in those days. In the last few decades, leaders and royals had been killed in Italy, Russia, France, even the United States. Often these events caused outrage, but not full-blown war. But this time, things were different. The Austro-Hungarian government was furious. Their heir was murdered by a Slavic nationalist. And worse, the assassin was linked to a network that led back to Serbia. Serbia was a small country, but growing in pride and ambition, and it had strong supporters in Russia. Austria-Hungary had long worried about its influence in the Balkans. This assassination felt like the final straw. Behind closed doors in Vienna, leaders met. Military generals, politicians, and the elderly emperor Franz Joseph debated what to do. Some wanted calm, but others, especially powerful figures in the military, wanted revenge. They believed Serbia needed to be punished, to send a message. They also had reason to act fast. They had the backing of Germany. In early July, Austria-Hungary sent diplomats to Berlin. They met with Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor. He was shocked by the assassination but offered support. What's known now as the blank check, a promise that Germany would back Austria-Hungary no matter what. With Germany behind them, Austria-Hungary grew bold. They spent weeks preparing, investigating, and writing a carefully worded ultimatum to Serbia. It demanded that Serbia let Austro-Hungarian officials conduct an investigation inside Serbia, a clear violation of its sovereignty. The demands were made to be rejected. On July 23rd, nearly a month after the assassination, the ultimatum was delivered. Serbia had 48 hours to respond. Serbia panicked. Its leaders scrambled to buy time. They accepted most of the demands, but rejected the key point about foreign investigators. It was too humiliating, too dangerous. On July 25th, Austria-Hungary broke off diplomatic ties. War was now almost certain. 2 days later, on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the shots in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The fuse had reached the powder. Within hours, Serbia called on Russia. The Tsar Nicholas II knew he couldn't back down. Russia had to support its Slavic brothers. Mobilization began. Trains moved troops. Orders were signed. Messages sent. Germany saw this and reacted quickly. It gave Russia a warning. Stop mobilizing, or face war. Russia didn't stop, so on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. France was next. Bound by alliance, preparing for conflict, it began moving its forces too. Germany now faced war on 2 fronts, the nightmare it always feared. That meant speed was vital. They had to strike first. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, but to reach France, German troops had to pass through Belgium, a neutral country. Belgium refused, so on August 4th, Germany invaded. That same day, Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. The dominoes had fallen. In just over a month, a small spark in a distant city had set Europe on fire, and it all began with 2 bullets on a summer morning. Franz Ferdinand's death didn't cause the war, not alone, but it gave the perfect excuse for rival powers to act. The alliances, the fears, the nationalism, the weapons, they were all waiting. The assassination was just the trigger. In Vienna, people mourned their Archduke, but also braced for war. In Berlin, men cheered in the streets, believing victory would be quick. In Paris, trains filled with soldiers waving flags and flowers. In London, newspapers printed maps. And politicians made speeches. No one fully understood what was coming. They thought the war would be over by Christmas. They had no idea it would last over 4 years, that it would kill millions, that it would change the world forever. The world was marching towards something darker than it had ever known. The spark had become a flame, and soon that flame would consume all of Europe. Chapter 3. The Web of Alliances. It began with just 2 countries, Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but it didn't stay that way for long. Within days, the fire spread across Europe. Cities that once traded goods and culture were now trading threats and ultimatums. And it wasn't random, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a web and a carefully spun invisible trap made of promises and treaties, loyalty and fear. For years before the war, Europe had tied itself together with secret deals and formal alliances. Each power didn't just stand alone, it stood connected to others. These alliances were supposed to keep peace, but instead, they made sure that once one nation fell into war, others were pulled in too, whether they wanted to or not. To understand why the war exploded so fast, we have to step back to the years before the assassination, back to a continent that looked calm on the surface but was full of tension underneath. After the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, a new power rose in the heart of Europe, Germany. Fast, industrial, efficient. It unified into a strong empire under Otto von Bismarck and quickly became a rival to older giants like Britain, France and Russia. Bismarck, the master strategist, knew this rising power could make enemies. So he built a system of agreements to keep Germany safe and keep France isolated. He formed the Triple Alliance in 1882, a formal military agreement between Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. If one was attacked by 2 or more countries, the others would help. It was designed to keep peace through strength, but strength invites suspicion. On the other side, France didn't want to be alone. It looked east and found an ally in Russia. Despite being very different, a republic and an empire, they had something in common: concern about Germany. In 1894, they signed the Franco-Russian alliance, and then came Britain. For most of the 19th century, Britain followed a policy of splendid isolation. It didn't want to get dragged into continental politics. But that changed in the early 1900s. Germany's navy was growing, tensions in the colonies were rising, and so Britain began to look for friends. In 1904, Britain signed an understanding with France, the Entente Cordiale. Then, in 1907, it reached an agreement with Russia. These weren't as strict as the Triple Alliance, but together, France, Russia and Britain formed what became known as the Triple Entente. Now Europe had two major camps. On one side, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. On the other, France, Russia, and Britain. Each side promised to support the other in case of attack. But here's the problem. These promises didn't stay simple. They were tangled, filled with secret terms and overlapping commitments. And when the crisis came in 1914, these alliances didn't stop the war, they guaranteed it. Let's go back to that moment. After the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and declared war. Serbia turned to Russia for help, and Russia began mobilizing its massive army. Now Germany was watching closely. It had promised to support Austria-Hungary, but it also saw Russia as a threat, a huge, slow-moving threat, but a dangerous one. So Germany issued a warning to Russia: stop mobilizing or face war. Russia didn't back down. Germany now faced a nightmare: war on two fronts. To the east, Russia; to the west, France. They had long feared this. German military leaders had a plan, the Schlieffen Plan: strike France first, knock them out quickly, then turn east to face Russia. But to do that, Germany had to go through Belgium, a neutral country protected by a treaty signed by major powers, including Britain. Germany invaded Belgium anyway, and that changed everything. Britain wasn't directly allied with France or Russia in a way that forced them to act. But the invasion of Belgium triggered a sense of duty and an old promise. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Now, in less than 2 weeks, a local dispute had become a continental war. Let's follow the chain of events again. Through the web of alliances, Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. Serbia calls on Russia. Russia mobilizes. Germany declares war on Russia. France is allied with Russia, so Germany declares war on France. Germany invades Belgium. Britain enters to defend Belgium and support France. One link pulled the next. One promise pulled another, and the war machine roared to life. But the web didn't just stop in Europe. These alliances stretched across empires. When Britain entered the war, so did its colonies, from Canada to Australia to India. When France joined, so did troops from North Africa and Indochina. The Russian Empire pulled in men from Central Asia and the Caucasus. Even Japan, allied with Britain since 1902, declared war on Germany in late August 1914 and began seizing German territories in the Pacific. Soon, even the Ottoman Empire joined France, but not on the side many expected. For months the Ottomans hesitated, but Germany had been courting them with money, weapons, and military advisors. In October, the Ottomans entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers. The web pulled in another major empire. By the end of 1914, the world was at war, and it wasn't just because of hatred or ambition. It was because of obligation. 12 promises made in times of peace that turned deadly in times of crisis. And here's the tragic part. Many of those alliances were defensive. They were supposed to prevent war. The logic was simple. If everyone had strong friends, no one would dare to attack. But the moment one spark was lit, that same logic caused a chain reaction. Because once mobilization started, backing down became impossible. To hesitate was to look weak. To pause was to risk betrayal. Every country believed it was acting in self-defense, even as they plunged the world into disaster. Germany claimed it was protecting Austria-Hungary. Russia claimed it was protecting Serbia. France claimed it was protecting itself from Germany. Britain claimed it was protecting Belgium and European balance. Austria-Hungary claimed it was protecting its empire from rebels, and so on. No one thought they were starting a world war, but each step made the next one inevitable. And once the armies began to move, by train, by horse, by foot, there was no turning back. Within weeks, trenches were dug. Lines were drawn. Battles began. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was just beginning. And behind all of it, like a spider's web catching every struggling fly, was the system of alliances. Some were public, some secret. Some clear, some vague, but all of them carried weight. It was a war born not just of gunfire, but of promises. Some call it honor, some call it madness. But in the end, millions of people died for agreements they never signed between countries they never saw. The leaders who built the web never imagined it would tear down the world. But it did. And now, across Europe, nations stood locked in combat, not just for territory but for survival. The alliances had done their job, they had brought the world together, just not in peace, in war. Chapter 4. The July Crisis, the countdown to war. The bullet that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand didn't just end a man's life. It started a clock. From that moment in Sarajevo, the world had 1 month before everything would change. 31 days, a countdown toward catastrophe. And it didn't begin with shouting or gunfire. It began with telegrams, with meetings behind closed doors, with carefully chosen words that sounded calm, but carried the weight of war. At first, it didn't seem like a global disaster was coming. The world had seen assassinations before. Kings, queens, presidents, leaders had been killed in the past and war didn't always follow. But this one was different. Because the death of Franz Ferdinand didn't just wound Austria-Hungary's pride. It gave them a reason to act. For years, Austria-Hungary had watched Serbia with growing unease. Serbia was small but fiercely nationalistic, and many in the empire saw it as a threat, a rebellious neighbor stirring up trouble among the Slavic people within Austria's borders. The assassination gave the empire a perfect excuse to strike, back to deal with Serbia once and for all, but Austria-Hungary couldn't do it alone. They needed support, and they turned to their most powerful ally, Germany. So just 5 days after the assassination, on July 5, 1914, Austria's leaders met with the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. They presented their case. Serbia had to be punished, harshly, and they wanted to know, would Germany stand by them? The Kaiser said yes. In fact, he gave what became known as the blank check, a promise of unconditional support. No matter what Austria decided to do, Germany would back them up. With that reassurance, Austria-Hungary began preparing a response, but not immediately. They didn't act right away. They waited, partly because their top generals were on summer vacation, and partly because they wanted to be careful. They knew that any move against Serbia might provoke Russia, and they didn't want to look like the aggressors, so they spent the next 2 weeks crafting something that looked like diplomacy, but was really a trap. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered a 10-point ultimatum to Serbia. It was a list of demands, and they were harsh. Serbia was told to suppress anti-Austrian propaganda, remove officials Austria didn't like, and let Austrian agents operate on Serbian soil to investigate the assassination. It was a demand for humiliation. Austria knew Serbia would never agree to all of it. That was the point. They wanted to provoke rejection, and then claim they had no choice but to declare war. But Serbia didn't entirely reject it. Surprisingly, Serbia accepted most of the demands, even the ones that hurt their national pride. They only asked for clarification on one point, allowing Austrian police to operate in Serbia. That, they said, would violate their sovereignty. To almost everyone watching, Serbia's reply seemed reasonable. Even Britain, France, and Russia thought it was enough to avoid war, but Austria didn't care. They had made up their minds before the ultimatum was ever delivered. On July 25th, 2 days after sending the list, they cut off diplomatic ties with Serbia and began mobilizing their army. Now the clock ticked faster. Serbia, realizing war was coming, turned to its protector, Russia, and Russia, under Tsar Nicholas, II now faced a terrible decision. On one hand, Russia couldn't let Serbia fall. It saw itself as the guardian of Slavic nations. Backing down would make Russia look weak. But on the other hand, supporting Serbia meant risking war with Germany and possibly with Austria's allies. Still, the Tsar hesitated. In the days that followed, telegrams flew back and forth between capitals, especially between Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. The two men were cousins. They had a close personal relationship, even calling each other Willie and Nicky in their messages. They both claimed they didn't want war. They both hoped the other would back down. But while they wrote to each other, their armies moved. Russia began a partial mobilization on July 29th, preparing troops near its border with Austria. Germany saw this as a threat, not just to Austria, but to themselves. And so Germany responded. On July 31st, Germany issued its own ultimatum, and this time to Russia. Stop mobilizing or face war. At the same time, Germany also warned France, stay neutral in any conflict with Russia or face consequences. Neither country backed down. Russia refused to stop mobilizing. France began preparing its own troops. Next day, August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The day after that, August 2nd, Germany demanded that Belgium, a neutral country, allow German troops to pass through so they could attack France more easily. Belgium refused, so on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, and on August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium. That invasion triggered Britain's entry into the war due to a long-standing agreement to protect Belgian neutrality. In just 11 days, 5 major powers were now at war. The July crisis had ended. The countdown was over, and the war had begun. But the real tragedy of those 31 days was this. No one believed it would actually happen. Even as ultimatums were sent and troops were mobilized, many leaders thought they could still pull back at the last minute. That reason would win, that diplomacy would hold, that war would be avoided, or if it happened, would be quick and clean. They were wrong, because the systems in place, alliances, mobilization plans, secret treaties, weren't built for flexibility. They were built like machines. Once turned on, they couldn't be stopped. Take Germany's Schlieffen Plan, for example. It was a rigid schedule that assumed war with France and Russia would happen together. Germany had to move fast to defeat France before turning to Russia. The entire plan depended on speed and surprise. That's why Germany couldn't wait. Once Russia mobilized, the German military insisted they had to act, even if France hadn't declared war yet. Waiting, they said, would mean disaster. So even as diplomats talked, even as emperors and kings exchanged messages, the armies kept moving. The train schedules were set. The troops were marching. The plans were in motion. And once Belgium was invaded, it wasn't just a military issue, it was a moral one. The world saw Germany as the aggressor. A neutral country had been attacked. Civilians were in danger. Cities were burning. Britain, still undecided just days before, now had a clear reason to fight. The July crisis wasn't just a diplomatic failure. It was a perfect storm of fear, pride, miscommunication, and bad timing. Each leader believed they were acting defensively. Austria-Hungary wanted to punish Serbia, not to start a world war. Germany wanted to support Austria and protect itself from encirclement. Russia wanted to protect Serbia and avoid losing face. France wanted to support its Russian ally and defend against German aggression. Britain wanted to stop Belgium from being crushed and maintain European balance. But intentions didn't matter anymore, because the moment Austria declared war on Serbia, the machine was set in motion. There were moments it could have stopped. There were days when better communication or more time might have changed the outcome, but the fuse had been lit in Sarajevo, and by the end of July, the explosion was inevitable. Now soldiers were boarding trains with rifles slung over their shoulders. Families stood at stations waving goodbye, believing their sons would be home by Christmas. Crowds cheered in the streets wrapped in flags, singing anthems. It felt like a patriotic adventure. No one understood what was coming. The mud, the blood, the endless lines of barbed wire, the trenches, the gas, the years of slaughter. The world had never seen anything like what was about to happen. The July crisis was over, and the war to end all wars had begun. Chapter 5. The Declaration. War erupts across Europe. The fuse had been lit. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was no longer just a Balkan crisis. It had become a European problem, and that problem was quickly spinning into a disaster. The July crisis had cracked open fault lines between old empires, and now those cracks were splitting wide open. The world was holding its breath, but not for long. It was the final days of July 1914. Diplomats raced back and forth with ultimatums, proposals, and desperate attempts to hold things together. But the machinery of war had already started to grind forward. Trains were being loaded. Orders were being signed. Troops were moving. And the words that would change everything had begun to echo. We declare war. Austria-Hungary moved first. After waiting for Serbia's reply to its ultimatum, a reply that was surprisingly conciliatory but not enough, Austria decided it was time. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially declared war on Serbia. Cannons opened fire on Belgrade, the Serbian capital, as the Austro-Hungarian army began its invasion. The shot that killed Franz Ferdinand had now become a war between two countries, but it didn't stop there. This wasn't a war just between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. It couldn't be. Russia, Serbia's powerful ally, watched closely. The Russians saw Austria's attack not only as aggression against Serbia, but as an attempt to dominate the Balkans entirely. And Russia had long-standing ambitions in the region. It wanted influence. It wanted to protect its Slavic brothers. And perhaps most importantly, it couldn't afford to look weak. So Russia began to mobilize. This wasn't a declaration of war, at least not yet, but it was close. Russian mobilization was a massive operation. Railways were activated. Soldiers were called up. Thousands began to move toward the western borders. Russia said it was only mobilizing against Austria-Hungary, not Germany. But Germany didn't believe that. To the German military planners, a partial mobilization by Russia didn't make sense. Russia couldn't move against Austria without threatening Germany. Germany saw this as a trap, a slow, dangerous trap closing in. If Germany waited too long, it might find itself surrounded, attacked by both Russia in the east and France in the west. So Germany demanded that Russia stop mobilizing. But Russia didn't stop. Germany had spent years preparing for this moment. Every German general knew the plan. It was called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was brutal in its clarity. Strike first, strike fast. Knock out France quickly before Russia can fully mobilize. Then turn back and face Russia. It was a plan built on speed and precision. But it was also a plan that depended on one key assumption, that Germany could pass through neutral Belgium to reach France. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and 2 days later, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. Europe was unraveling by the hour. At this point, the British were watching carefully. Britain was technically not bound to jump in just yet. Yes, it had agreements with France and Russia, but they weren't ironclad. The British government hesitated. They didn't want war. Not yet. Not unless there was a clear reason. That reason came on August 4th, 1914, when Germany invaded Belgium. Now this was different. Britain had long held a commitment to protect Belgium's neutrality. That commitment had been signed decades earlier. And when German troops marched through Belgian territory without permission, it was more than just a strategic move. It was a violation of international law. British newspapers exploded with headlines. Public outrage grew. In Parliament, the Aue case was made. This wasn't just about alliances anymore. This was about protecting a small nation from aggression. And so, on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. Within a single week, what had started as a regional crisis had turned into a full-blown European war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Russia, Britain, all locked in. It was like dominoes falling, each one hitting the next. But these weren't wooden tiles. These were nations, empires, millions of lives. And it wasn't just Europe anymore. In Africa, colonial troops were being called up. French and British colonies prepared to defend their empires. German colonies were put on alert. In Asia, Japan was watching closely. And across the ocean, even countries not yet involved, like the United States, were beginning to pay attention. The war was spreading. In cities across Europe, people flooded the streets. Flags waved, brass bands played, men in uniforms marched. With pride, some with smiles on their faces, convinced the war would be over by Christmas, posters were printed, speeches were made. Young men lined up to enlist, some lying about their age just to join the fight. There was a strange, almost surreal sense of excitement in the air. National pride had been awakened. Many people believed they were fighting for justice, honor, or survival. They didn't yet understand what kind of war this would become. Meanwhile, the generals began their moves. Germany sent its army racing west through Belgium, encountering far more resistance than expected. The Belgian army, though small, fought with surprising determination, and German brutality in occupied towns quickly turned world opinion against them. French troops launched their own attacks along the border, eager to reclaim lost territory, like Alsace and Lorraine. But they suffered heavy losses. Their colorful uniforms, bravery, and outdated tactics collided with the grim reality of modern warfare: machine guns, heavy artillery, and deadly efficiency. In the east, Russian forces began to pour into German territory, but the vast distances, poor planning, and communication breakdowns would soon create chaos of their own. The war was no longer theoretical. It was real, bloody, fast-moving, unpredictable. And yet, there was still a sense that this would be quick. Politicians and generals believed victory would come fast, that one big battle would settle things, that by fall the soldiers would be home. They were wrong. More countries were about to get involved. The Ottoman Empire was watching, Italy was undecided, and other regions, the Balkans, the Middle East, the colonies, would soon become new front lines in a war that was expanding by the day. But at this moment, in early August 1914, the war had officially begun. And there was no turning back. The declarations had been made, the alliances triggered, the armies mobilized, the cannons fired. From the muddy trenches in Belgium to the forests of Eastern Europe to the hills of Serbia and the streets of Paris, the world had changed in just a few short weeks. The age of empires had collided with the age of industrial warfare. This was no longer a political crisis. This was the Great War, and it was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's blitzkrieg that wasn't. When Germany declared war on France and Russia in early August 1914, its military had no time to sit and plan. Everything was already set in motion. Orders were being followed, like clockwork. Trains were rolling, troops were moving. Because for years Germany had been preparing for this exact moment. Not in theory, not in speeches, but in one of the most detailed military strategies ever written, the Schlieffen Plan. Named after its creator, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the plan was born out of fear. Germany feared one thing above all: fighting. A war on two fronts at the same time. On the east, Russia. On the west, France. If both enemies attacked together, Germany would be caught in a deadly squeeze. So the plan's solution was simple on paper: attack first, attack hard, and knock out France quickly, before Russia had time to fully mobilize. But simple on paper didn't mean simple in practice. The idea was to sweep through Belgium and the Netherlands, swing down into France like a giant hammer, and capture Paris within 6 weeks. Germany believed it could deliver a lightning-fast knockout blow. If France fell quickly, Germany could then turn east and deal with the slower-moving Russian army. Speed, surprise, and momentum were everything, but from the very beginning things didn't go as planned. For one, the original Schlieffen Plan actually called for invading both Belgium and the Netherlands, but when the plan was later revised by Helmuth von Moltke, Germany's military chief at the time, the Dutch part was removed. Germany wanted to keep Dutch neutrality so they could use Dutch ports for trade. This change made the German route more narrow, and that would prove costly. Still, on August 4, 1914, German troops crossed into Belgium. The first obstacle was the fortress city of Liège. German generals expected it to fall within 2 days, but the Belgians fought back with a ferocity that shocked everyone. The forts around Liège held out for almost 2 weeks, and every extra day of resistance threw off Germany's carefully timed schedule. As the Germans pushed deeper into Belgium, their army grew more brutal. Civilians were executed. Villages were burned. Stories of atrocities began spreading quickly. Whether exaggerated or not, they lit a fire of public outrage across Europe. Germany's hope of a swift, clean campaign was now stained by blood and resistance. Meanwhile, France launched its own offensive along the eastern border, trying to reclaim Alsace and Lorraine, territory lost decades earlier in the Franco-Prussian War. French troops wore bright blue and red uniforms and charged into battle with high morale. But they were met with devastating German firepower. Thousands were killed. France's early attacks failed, and its army was forced into retreat. Germany's plan was working, but only on the surface. The right wing of the German army, the part sweeping through Belgium and northern France, was supposed to be incredibly strong, much stronger than the left wing near Alsace. That was Schlieffen's original vision, a massive right hook. But Moltke had weakened the right wing to reinforce the left. It was a subtle shift, but it meant that the most important part of the attack didn't have the overwhelming force it needed. And then came Britain. Germany had hoped that Britain might stay out of the war. But when German troops marched into Belgium, that hope vanished. Britain declared war, and the British Expeditionary Force, small but well-trained, landed in France. At the Battle of Mons, British forces clashed with the advancing Germans. Though outnumbered, the British held firm and inflicted heavy casualties before retreating. It wasn't a massive victory, but it slowed the German advance again. And time was the enemy of the Schlieffen Plan. The German army kept marching south and west, pushing the French and British forces back toward Paris. But with every mile gained, their supply lines stretched thinner. Soldiers were exhausted, horses collapsed, food and ammunition were running behind schedule. The terrain wasn't what they'd expected, and the resistance was fiercer than they had hoped. By early September, German troops were within 30 miles of Paris. The French government had already fled the capital. Panic was spreading. This was it, the moment the Germans had been counting on. But Paris didn't fall. Instead, something unexpected happened. French intelligence, using aerial reconnaissance, something very new at the time, noticed that the German right flank was exposed. Moltke had moved some troops away to fight the Russians in the east. That weakened the line, and French General Joseph Joffre saw his chance. On September 6, 1914, French and British forces launched a counterattack at the Marne River. It caught the Germans off guard. Over several days of brutal fighting, the tide began to turn. German troops, stretched too thin and facing supply problems, started to retreat. It was the first major turning point of the war. The Battle of the Marne stopped the German advance in its tracks. Paris was saved. The Schlieffen Plan, this grand vision of a quick, clean German victory, had failed. Germany's retreat didn't mean the end of fighting. It meant the end of movement. Both sides dug in. Trenches were built. Barbed wire was rolled out. And soon a new kind of war had begun. A war of mud, of artillery, of long, drawn-out battles where gaining a few yards could cost thousands of lives. This wasn't the war anyone had expected. For Germany, the failure of the Schlieffen Plan was devastating. They had gambled everything on speed and precision. But the resistance in Belgium, the arrival of British troops, the stubborn defense of France, and the exhaustion of the German army had all worked against them. And now, instead of a short war, Germany faced a nightmare, a two-front war with no clear path to victory. In the east, Russia was already putting pressure on Germany's weaker flank. In the west, France and Britain were regrouping and digging in. The plan that was supposed to avoid this exact situation had delivered it instead. Moltke, the man who had modified the plan, was crushed by the outcome. He was soon replaced. German. Morale was shaken, but their generals vowed to keep fighting. The trenches weren't just a tactic, they became a symbol of the war itself, a frozen line stretching across Europe, filled with fear, mud, and death. But in that first month, before the trenches, before the gas, before the tanks, there was a vision, a plan, a swift strike, a belief that war could be quick and decisive. That vision died at the Marne. The Schlieffen Plan had been bold, calculated, ruthless, and ultimately impossible. From here on out, the war would not be fast, it would not be clean, and it would not be over by Christmas. Chapter 7. Battle of the Marne, the end of the Blitzkrieg. The German army was on the move, fast and brutal. Town after town fell as they stormed through Belgium and into France, driving the French armies back and forcing the British Expeditionary Force to retreat. The Schlieffen Plan, despite a few setbacks, still seemed to be working. Paris was now just over 30 miles away. The German generals could almost see victory, but something was changing. The advance that had begun with unstoppable force was starting to slow. The German troops were exhausted. They had marched hundreds of miles, fighting almost non-stop. Their supply lines were stretched too far. Food, ammunition, even fresh horses were all lagging behind. Rain and mud made the roads worse, and most importantly, they had overextended themselves. Their lines were too thin, and their flanks, the sides of their army, were vulnerable. Still, they pushed forward, chasing the belief that a quick victory was just around the corner. Inside Paris, panic was everywhere. The French government had fled south. Shops were closed. People were packing whatever they could and leaving. Many feared that the city would fall just like Belgium's cities had, quickly and violently. But the French army wasn't done yet. Neither were the British. Something critical happened at that point, something that would shift the course of the war. A gap opened up in the German lines. It wasn't obvious at first. The German First Army under General von Kluck had swung too, far east of Paris, exposing the right side of the army. Meanwhile, the Second Army under General von Bülow had drifted too far south. Between them was a weak spot, an opening. And this small gap would become a turning point. The French Commander-in-Chief, General Joseph Joffre, had been under immense pressure. His earlier offensives in Alsace-Lorraine had failed badly, but he hadn't lost hope. He was calm, calculating, and willing to adapt. Now, seeing the exposed German flank, he realized this was the opportunity France desperately needed, and so he ordered a counterattack. But it wasn't just a regular attack, it was massive, involving over 1 million Allied troops. French armies, supported by the British, would strike the German right flank with everything they had, and they had to do it fast. To pull this off, Joffre made a bold move. He created a new French army, the Sixth Army, from scratch. Troops were rushed in from across the country, and perhaps most famously, Parisian taxi drivers were called upon to help move thousands of soldiers to the front. It became a symbol of France's determination, ordinary civilians doing their part in a moment of crisis. The battle began on September 6, 1914. For the first time in weeks, German troops were no longer advancing. They were fighting to hold their position. The Allies launched wave after wave of attacks. At first, the Germans resisted well, but the pressure kept building. More troops poured in. French artillery was hammering German positions. The British pushed from one side, the French from another. The Germans, still powerful but spread too thin, began to struggle. The battle raged for several days. Soldiers fought in villages, forests, and open fields. The noise of guns, the screams, the confusion. It was chaos. Communication broke down. Trenches hadn't even been dug yet. The front was constantly shifting. Then, something happened that sealed the fate of the German plan. General Moltke, the German Chief of Staff, was far from the battlefield. He wasn't able to see clearly what was unfolding. Reports were scattered, communication lines were weak, and his orders weren't always reaching the front. Under the stress, Moltke reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown. Leadership faltered. At the worst possible moment, German commanders at the front, realizing they couldn't hold their position and fearing complete collapse, began to retreat. It wasn't an organized pullback. It was a desperate effort to avoid being surrounded. By September 12th, the German army had pulled back across the Aisne River. The Allies had won. The victory stunned both sides. For France and Britain, it was a moment of relief and pride. Paris was safe. The nightmare of a quick German conquest was over. For Germany, it was a devastating blow. The Schlieffen Plan, their carefully timed blueprint for victory, was dead. This wasn't just a battlefield defeat, it was a strategic disaster. Germany had failed to knock out France in the opening weeks of the war. That meant they now had to face the exact situation they had tried so hard to avoid. A long, grinding war on two fronts. Russia was mobilizing in the east, France and Britain were regrouping in the west, and Germany was caught in between. But the consequences of the Battle of the Marne didn't stop there. After the retreat, both sides began to dig in. Literally, soldiers dug trenches to protect themselves from enemy fire. The trenches were supposed to be temporary, just something to hold the line for a few days. But those few days turned into weeks, then months, then years. Trench warfare had begun, and with it came a new kind of horror. The wide, sweeping movements of early battles were replaced by slow, brutal fighting over tiny pieces of land. The war became about inches, not miles. Mud, barbed wire, rats, disease. These would become the new realities of life on the front. But all of that started here, at the Marne. The failure of the German advance also shattered the illusion that the war would be over by Christmas. People had cheered in the streets when war was declared, believing it would be short and glorious. But now the world saw the truth. This was going to be long, hard, bloody, and different from any war that had come before. The Germans blamed their high command. Moltke was removed from his position and replaced. Some generals believed they had been just days, maybe even hours, from victory. They blamed the weakening of the right flank, the delay in Belgium, the British interference. But the truth was simpler. The plan had underestimated everything. The speed of Allied response, the resilience of the French, the mobility of British forces, and the sheer unpredictability of war. The Allies, while relieved, also understood what was coming. Victory at the Marne had saved France, but it had not ended the war. It had only changed its shape. Both sides began what would become known as the race to the sea, a frantic attempt to outflank each other by moving north, all the way to the North Sea. But each move was countered, each attempt blocked. More trenches were dug. The line solidified. The front froze. From the Swiss border to the sea, a wall of men, mud, and misery stretched across Europe. And so, the Battle of the Marne marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The fast-moving war that Germany had planned for was gone. In its place came something darker, something far more destructive, a war of attrition. By stopping the German advance, the Allies had saved themselves from immediate defeat. But they had also entered into a kind of war they weren't prepared for. No one was. The generals would have to invent new strategies. The soldiers would have to endure the unimaginable, and the people back home would have to accept a grim truth. This war wasn't going away anytime soon. It's strange to think that one exposed flank, one moment of overconfidence, one misstep in a river valley outside Paris could shift the course of world history. But it did. The Battle of the Marne may not be as well known today as some later battles, but it was the first great turning point of the First World War. It didn't end the war. It reshaped it. And as the trenches were dug and the barbed wire rolled out, a new chapter was beginning, one that would define the next 4 years of suffering and sacrifice. Chapter 8. Trench warfare begins. Life in the mud. After the Battle of the Marne, the war changed shape. Germany's dream of a quick victory had collapsed, and both sides were left scrambling to figure out what to do next. The German armies, no longer on the offensive, began digging in, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The land they had gained had to be held. And if the enemy was going to try and take it back, they'd make sure it wouldn't be easy. At first, the trenches were simple, just shallow ditches dug by hand, barely wide enough for a man to lie in. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, these ditches grew deeper, wider and more complex. Wooden planks were laid down to walk on. Sandbags were stacked for cover. Dugouts were carved into the sides for shelter. What started as a temporary solution became a permanent reality, and it wasn't just the Germans. The French and British armies, realizing they couldn't break through the German lines, began building trenches of their own. Soon a line of trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, hundreds of miles of mud, wire, and misery. This was the Western Front, and it would barely move for the next 4 years. Life in the trenches wasn't just hard, it was hell. Imagine waking up every day surrounded by mud, Not just ordinary mud, but thick, sticky, stinking mud that clung to your boots, soaked your clothes, and swallowed anything that touched the ground. Rain made everything worse. Trenches would flood. Water would rise above your ankles, sometimes to your knees. Soldiers had to sleep standing up, leaning against the walls because lying down meant being soaked. And then there were the rats. Huge, aggressive rats that thrived in the trenches. They fed on garbage, leftover food, and even the dead. They would crawl over sleeping soldiers, chew on uniforms, and bite if disturbed. No one could escape them. Soldiers tried shooting them, stabbing them, even hitting them with shovels, but they kept coming. Disease was everywhere. One of the worst was trench foot, a condition caused by standing in cold, wet conditions for too long. The skin on a soldier's feet would rot, turn black, and in severe cases lead to amputation. Hygiene was almost impossible. There were no toilets, just holes in the ground. Flies swarmed everywhere. Dysentery, typhus, and lice outbreaks were common. The stench of sweat, mud, rotting flesh, and unwashed bodies filled the air. Food was another daily struggle. Supplies had to be brought to the front lines under enemy fire, so meals were often basic and cold. Hard biscuits, tins of bully beef, and weak tea were common. Sometimes the food was moldy or filled with maggots. Fresh meat and vegetables were rare. Water had to be carried in and often tasted of chlorine, added to kill bacteria. But worse than all of that was the constant threat of death. Trenches might seem like protection, but they were also death traps. Artillery shells exploded above and around them, sending deadly shrapnel in every direction. Snipers watched from across no man's land, waiting for the slightest movement. A soldier lifting his head above the parapet, even for a second, risked being shot. Gas attacks became a terrifying new weapon. Without warning, clouds of chlorine or mustard gas would drift in, burning lungs, blinding eyes, and leaving soldiers choking or worse. There was no true safety. Every so often, an order would come down, prepare to go over the top. That meant climbing out of the trench and charging across no man's land toward the enemy lines. No man's land was a wasteland, craters from shells, barbed wire, mud, and the bodies of the fallen. Charging through it was almost suicidal. Machine guns mowed down entire waves of men before they reached halfway. Some attacks lasted minutes, others turned into hours of horror, and when it was over, whether the attack succeeded or failed, the soldiers returned to the trenches if they made it back alive. The mental toll of trench warfare was just as brutal as the physical. Soldiers lived with constant fear. Fear of the next shell, fear of the next gas attack, fear of being called up for an assault. Many developed what was known as shell shock, what we'd now call PTSD. They'd shake uncontrollably, become mute, lose the ability to walk or speak. Some would scream in their sleep. Others became numb, detached from reality. Doctors didn't always know how to treat them, and often didn't try. But somehow, despite all this, soldiers endured. They built routines to survive. They wrote letters. They joked. They cleaned their weapons, shaved, played cards, and sang songs. Christmas 1914 even brought something unexpected. In some areas along the front, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches, met in the middle, and exchanged gifts. They played football, shared food, sang together. For a brief moment, the war paused, and humanity broke through the madness. But moments like that were rare and short-lived. As the war dragged on, the trenches grew deeper, the wire thicker, and the attacks more deadly. Engineers added more features, dugouts that went deep underground, command posts, field, hospitals, ammo storage. Trenches were organized into systems: front lines, support trenches, reserve trenches, all connected by communication trenches. Moving through them was like navigating a maze. Still, the basic life of a trench soldier remained unchanged. Wet, cold, hungry, afraid. Rotations helped. Soldiers didn't stay in the front line forever. Typically, they spent a few days on the front, then were rotated to a reserve trench, then to the rear for brief rest. But even in the rear, they could hear the guns. Even behind the lines, they weren't truly safe. And for those left at home, the reality of trench life was hard to imagine. Posters and propaganda painted war as heroic. Newspapers gave short updates with little detail, but the letters sent back from the front told a different story, some filled with cheer and optimism, others with despair. Families waited for news. Some received letters, others received telegrams, with the words, "We regret to inform you." Trench warfare wasn't limited to just one location. Though most famously associated with the Western Front, trenches also appeared in parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and other fronts. But it was in France and Belgium that the line stayed stuck, and trench life became the symbol of the war. Generals and politicians back home still hoped for breakthroughs. They launched massive offensives, throwing hundreds of thousands of men into battle, trying to break the deadlock. But again and again they failed. The cost was horrific. Fields soaked with blood for the gain of a few hundred yards. Then a counterattack would push it back. In the trenches, the soldiers called it the meat grinder. Still, they followed orders. They fought. They died. And they waited. By 1915, it became clear that trench warfare wasn't just a temporary phase. It was the new normal. The war that was supposed to be fast and glorious had become slow and gruesome. No one had planned for this. No one had imagined it would go on this long, and no one knew how to end it. New weapons were introduced to try and break the stalemate. Poison gas, flamethrowers, more powerful artillery. But these only made the trenches more terrible, not less. Tanks would appear later, but not yet, and not in a way that truly changed the war. The world had entered a new kind of conflict. Not one of sweeping cavalry charges or noble duels, but one of mud, wire, noise, and waiting. A war of endurance, of attrition, of survival. In the end, trench warfare defined the First World War more than any other element. It was where millions of men lived, fought, and died. It was where hope faded and horror became normal, and it was where a generation was changed forever, not just by the bullets and bombs, but by what they endured day after day, in the mud, under fire, hoping to make it home. Chapter 9. The Western Front. A war of attrition. By the time trench warfare had taken hold, the Western Front was no longer about bold moves or rapid victories. It had turned into something darker, something slower, and far more painful. This was no longer a war of strategy or clever planning. It became a war of wearing the other side down, a war of attrition. The goal wasn't to outsmart the enemy, it was to outlast them. After the trenches were dug from the North Sea to the Swiss border, both sides dug in, literally and mentally. Generals ordered attacks, hoping that just one big push could break the enemy's line. Just one offensive that would create a gap, lead to a breakthrough and end the war. But that never really happened. What did happen was thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of men dying for just a few yards of ground, and even when ground was gained, it was often lost again days later in a counterattack. Over and over this cycle repeated. Every attack started the same. Artillery would pound the enemy trenches for hours, sometimes days. The idea was to destroy their defenses, flatten their wire and kill as many soldiers as possible before the infantry moved in. Shells screamed overhead, exploding with deafening booms, sending shrapnel flying. The ground shook, the sky turned grey with smoke, and trenches were reduced to rubble. Then came the whistles. Soldiers would climb over the top and charge across no man's land. They ran into gunfire, barbed wire, and shell holes. Many never even made it halfway. Machine guns cut them down in seconds. Those who did reach the enemy line found that the artillery had often done less damage than hoped. The barbed wire was still there. The trenches still full of enemy soldiers ready to fight. And when the attack failed, and most did, the survivors stumbled back through the mud, wounded, shaken, and fewer in number. Then the next day, it might happen again, and again, and again. That's what made the Western Front so horrifying. It wasn't just one big, terrible battle. It was a constant grind of small attacks, big offensives, surprise raids, and endless shelling. A never-ending wave of death and destruction, with no end in sight. It wasn't just soldiers who suffered. The land itself was destroyed. Trees were shredded into splinters. Fields turned into barren, cratered wastelands. Entire villages were reduced to piles of stone. Nothing green remained. No birds, no animals, just mud and silence between the thunder of explosions. And through it all the men remained in the trenches. Some were new recruits, barely trained, terrified of what was to come. Others were veterans, hardened by months or years of war, numb to the horror around them. Every soldier carried the weight of fear. Fear of being killed, fear of being wounded, fear of going over the top, fear of never seeing home again. Casualties weren't always caused by combat. Disease, accidents, and exposure claimed many lives. So did despair. Some soldiers broke down completely. Some refused to go forward. Some tried to injure themselves just to escape the front. Others never came back from a patrol or disappeared in the night, consumed by darkness and fear. And yet for every man lost, another was sent to replace him. The war machine kept grinding. Nations back home started to feel the pressure. At first, people were full of hope. They believed in victory. They cheered their soldiers. But as the months passed and the casualty lists grew, that hope began to fade. Streets that once rang with parades and songs became filled with silence and mourning. Women wore black. Children asked when their fathers would come home. The answers never came. Governments knew morale was dropping. They used posters and speeches to keep the public on their side. They called for sacrifice, duty, and courage. Newspapers told stories of heroism. But the truth was harder to hide. So many were dying. So few gains were being made. And still, the front didn't move. One of the most infamous examples of this endless suffering came in 1916 at the Battle of Verdun. The Germans launched a massive assault on the French lines, hoping to bleed France white, to kill so many French soldiers that the country would collapse. The French, knowing they couldn't afford to lose Verdun, vowed to hold the line no matter what. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest battles in history. For 10 months, the two sides fought over hills, forts, and villages. Trenches were taken, lost, and taken again. Shells fell by the millions, bodies piled up, and yet neither side broke. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men were killed or wounded for almost no change in position. And still, the war dragged on. Later that year, the British launched their own major offensive along the Somme River. It was meant to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and finally break through the German lines. The first day of the battle of the Somme became the bloodiest day in British military history. Over 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded on day one. The battle continued for months. Villages were fought over one by one. Shells fell night and day. Rain turned everything to sludge. By the end, more than 1 million men from all sides were dead or wounded. And the front line? It had moved only a few miles. These battles were just 2 examples. There were many others: Ypres, Passchendaele, Loos, each one filled with horror, each one marked by mud, wire, blood, and pain. This was the reality of the Western Front, a war that had become a meat grinder, a place where human lives were spent like bullets, a war of numbers, of supply lines, of sheer endurance. Generals kept planning new attacks, new strategies, new weapons, but the core of it never changed. Men were sent forward, many did not return, and when it was over, another plan began. This wasn't the kind of war anyone had expected. Before 1914, wars had been short, with quick battles and decisive outcomes. This was something else entirely. A war where victory wasn't measured by territory gained, but by how many enemy soldiers you could kill, and whether you could keep fighting longer than they could. That's what made it a war of attrition. Germany believed that if they could keep pressure on France and Britain long enough, those countries would collapse. France believed that with enough determination, they could push the Germans out. Britain thought that superior resources would eventually wear down the Central Powers. Everyone hoped that just a little more sacrifice would bring victory, but none of them really knew when it would end, or how much more would be lost before it did. And as the years passed, the cost kept rising. Millions of soldiers dead, millions more wounded, many with injuries they would carry for life, limbs lost, faces disfigured, minds shattered, entire. Towns back home emptied of young men. The war was no longer about ideals or causes. It was about survival. It was about enduring one more bombardment, holding one more trench, digging in and holding on. And still, even in the darkest days, soldiers found ways to cope. They shared cigarettes, they wrote poetry. They found humor in small things, nicknames, songs, jokes, anything to make the days bearable, to remind themselves that they were still human in a world that had forgotten what that meant. By now, it was clear to everyone. This war would not end with one great victory. It would end when one side could no longer continue, when the weight of death, loss, and destruction became too much to bear. And on the Western Front, that weight grew heavier with every passing day. Chapter 10. The Eastern Front. War on a vast scale. While the Western Front was locked in a brutal stalemate filled with trenches, mud, and unending artillery barrages, another war was unfolding far to the east. It looked different. It felt different. But it was just as deadly. The Eastern Front, stretching across hundreds of miles of land, saw empires collide in a clash that was massive in scale, chaotic in movement, and devastating in its own way. Here, it wasn't just about a few yards of land. It was about sweeping offensives that covered hundreds of miles, vast plains where armies could move, regroup, and strike again. There were fewer trenches. The front was more fluid, but that didn't make it any less violent. In many ways, it was even more unpredictable. At the heart of it all was the Russian Empire, a giant with a massive population, an enormous army, and a deep sense of duty to defend its status and its allies. Russia had entered the war quickly after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the chain reaction that followed. They mobilized to protect Serbia, to honor alliances, and to stop German and Austro-Hungarian ambitions. But there was a problem. Russia's army was big, but not well equipped. Many soldiers didn't even have proper rifles. Some had to wait for others to fall in battle just to pick up a weapon. The country was struggling with outdated infrastructure, poor communication, and weak leadership. The generals often made bold moves without the resources to back them up. Still, in the early days of the war, Russia moved fast. Very fast. In August 1914, Russian forces surprised everyone by launching a massive attack into East Prussia, German territory. The Germans hadn't expected such a quick move and scrambled to respond. At first, it looked like Russia might have the upper hand. Two Russian armies advanced from different directions, threatening to crush the German forces caught in between. But then came the Battle of Tannenberg. The Germans, led by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, managed to intercept Russian communications. They figured out exactly what the Russians were planning and used that information to their advantage. In a matter of days, they encircled and destroyed one of the Russian armies, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. It was a crushing defeat for Russia and a major boost for German morale. Still, even after Tannenberg, the Russians kept pushing. The Eastern Front wasn't about one battle deciding everything. It was a constant back and forth, with one side gaining ground, then losing it. Cities and towns were taken, then abandoned. Whole regions were fought over multiple times. Unlike the narrow strip of trenches in the west, this front stretched for hundreds of miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany's ally, had its own problems. They struggled badly in the early months of the war. Their attempts to invade Serbia failed repeatedly. Their campaigns against Russia went poorly too. Austro-Hungarian armies were pushed back again and again, suffering heavy losses. Morale collapsed. Command structures broke down. It became clear that Austria-Hungary would not be able to handle the Eastern War without German help. So Germany stepped in. Together, the Central Powers launched joint offensives to regain lost territory. One of the most significant was the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive in 1915. It was a major German-led attack that punched through Russian lines in present-day Poland. The Russians were forced into a massive retreat, abandoning huge areas of land. Cities fell, railroads were lost, and tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were captured or killed. It was one of the most successful offensives of the war up to that point. But like everything in this war, success came with a cost. Villages were destroyed. Civilians were caught in the middle. many forced to flee their homes, others were arrested, executed, or deported. The war didn't just ruin armies, it ruined lives. The size of the front meant that battles weren't as predictable or contained as they were in the West. There were times when entire armies were surrounded or cut off, simply because of the vast distances and poor communication. Supply lines were stretched thin. Soldiers sometimes marched for days without food or rest. Trenches weren't always an option in the wide-open countryside, so soldiers dug in wherever they could, behind trees, in frozen ditches, or among ruins. The weather made everything worse. Winters in the east were brutally cold. Snowstorms swept through the battlefield. Soldiers froze in their coats, their boots stiff with ice. Equipment failed in the cold. Horses collapsed. Even guns jammed. In the summer, heat baked the land, and disease spread quickly through camps. Dysentery, typhus, and lice plagued the troops. Death didn't always come from bullets. What made the Eastern Front especially tragic was the human cost outside of battle. Millions of civilians lived in the war zones. They had no escape. Some were caught in the middle of artillery fire. Others were forced to feed and house soldiers or flee their homes with only what they could carry. Entire communities were uprooted. Some were accused of spying or helping the enemy and faced harsh punishments, sometimes execution without trial. Ethnic tensions added another layer of pain. The Eastern Front stretched across areas with mixed populations: Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and more. In the chaos of war, suspicion and hatred boiled over. Pogroms and forced relocations became common. Civilians often paid the price for the decisions made by generals hundreds of miles away. Russia, already struggling to modernize before the war, began to crack under the pressure. Factories couldn't keep up with demand. Transport systems broke down. Soldiers went into battle without rifles or proper clothing. Some had no boots. Others had only a few bullets a day. Food shortages hit both the army and the people back home. Hunger spread. Frustration turned to anger. By 1916, the Russian army had suffered millions of casualties, and yet the war continued. The Russian people started to lose faith in their leaders. The Tsar, Nicholas II, insisted on leading the army himself, even though he had little military experience. His decisions made things worse. At the same time, political unrest was growing. Protests broke out. Strikes paralyzed cities. Revolutionary ideas began to spread through the population, and even through the army ranks. Meanwhile, Germany and Austria-Hungary were also exhausted. Their victories on the Eastern Front came with a price. They had to keep sending troops east, weakening their forces in the west. The size of the front, the need to occupy captured areas, and the constant movement made everything more complicated. Even victories didn't feel like victories anymore. And still, despite all of this, battles kept happening. In 1916, the Russians launched a huge attack known as the Brusilov Offensive. It was one of their most successful operations of the war. Using surprise tactics and improved coordination, Russian forces broke through Austro-Hungarian lines and advanced deep into enemy territory. It shocked the Central Powers and showed that even after years of loss, Russia could still strike hard. But it wasn't enough to change the war. The offensive cost Russia dearly. The army was exhausted, supplies ran low, soldiers were demoralized, and while the Austro-Hungarians were shaken, the Germans stepped in once again to stop the Russian advance. The lines stabilized. The war dragged on. The Eastern Front had its own rhythm, fast, wide, chaotic. It didn't have the static trenches of France and Belgium, but it had its own kind of horror. Villages wiped out, armies broken, civilians crushed under the weight of moving fronts and retreating forces, and through it all, a sense that no matter how far one side advanced, nothing ever truly changed. By the end of 1916, both sides were nearing collapse. The soldiers were tired, the people were starving, the governments were losing control, and in Russia something far more dangerous than a foreign army was brewing: revolution. The war in the East had pushed Russia to its limits. Soon, those limits would snap, and when they did, everything would change, not just for the Eastern Front, but for the entire war. Chapter 11. The Ottoman Empire enters the war. How the Middle East became a new battlefield. After years of slow-burning decline, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the mighty force it had once been. By the time the First World War exploded across Europe in 1914, many considered the Ottomans the sick man of Europe. Their empire stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe, but it was riddled with internal problems, ethnic divisions, and political uncertainty. Still, it held strategic importance. The empire's location controlled vital trade routes, waterways, and territories that both sides of the war desperately cared about, and as the fighting intensified across Europe's battlefields and Russia's vast plains, it became clear the Ottomans wouldn't remain on the sidelines for long. At the start of the war, the Ottoman leadership was torn. Some wanted to stay neutral, not drag the empire into a European war. Others, especially those in the ruling elite known as the Young Turks, believed joining the war could restore the empire's strength. They saw it as an opportunity. If the Ottomans joined the right side, perhaps they could recover lost lands, gain new ones, and re-establish their influence. But the question was, which side? Britain, France, and Russia were powerful, but the Ottomans had a long and bitter history with Russia. The two empires had fought several wars over territory in the Caucasus and the Balkans. Russia had always wanted control over the Turkish Straits, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, vital waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Losing those would have crippled the Ottoman Empire. There was deep mistrust. The Ottomans didn't want to help an old enemy grow stronger, so when Germany came knocking, they listened. Germany had been courting the Ottoman Empire for years, sending military advisors, investing in railroads, and building economic ties. The Germans offered modern weapons, training, and promises. If the Ottomans joined the Central Powers, Germany said they would protect Ottoman territory and maybe even help them expand. It was a tempting offer, especially as German armies scored early victories and Russia looked shaky. Secret negotiations began, but the final push came in the form of 2 German warships. In August 1914, just days after the war started, 2 powerful German cruisers, the Goeben and the Breslau, fled from British pursuit in the Mediterranean. They raced toward the Ottoman-controlled Dardanelles, seeking refuge. The Ottomans allowed them in, claiming they had purchased the ships from Germany, even giving them new names and flying Ottoman flags. But everyone knew the truth. They were still German ships with German crews. When those ships later bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea, it became obvious. The Ottomans were entering the war, and they had picked their side. In late October 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially joined the Central Powers. Almost immediately, the war spread beyond Europe. The Middle East, the Caucasus, and parts of North Africa became new battlegrounds. The old Ottoman territories, already under pressure from internal revolts and colonial ambitions, were about to be pulled into a much larger storm. One of the first major fronts was the Caucasus, where Ottoman forces faced off against Russia. The terrain was harsh: mountains, deep snow, and bitter cold. Many Ottoman soldiers weren't properly equipped for winter conditions. Their leadership made poor strategic decisions. In early 1915, they launched an ambitious offensive at Sarikamish, hoping to catch Russian forces off guard, but it turned into a disaster. The plan was overcomplicated. Supplies ran out. Soldiers froze to death in the snow. The Russians counterattacked. Tens of thousands of Ottoman troops were lost. But the defeat didn't just damage the army. It also had horrifying consequences for civilians. After the Sarikamish disaster, Ottoman leaders blamed local Armenian communities, accusing them of helping the Russians. Suspicion turned to violence. In 1915, the Ottoman government began a brutal campaign of mass arrests, forced deportations, and killings. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the war: the Armenian genocide. Over 1 million Armenians were driven from their homes, sent on death marches, or executed outright. The empire used the cover of war to carry out what it called relocation, but in reality it was systematic destruction. Families were torn apart, entire villages were wiped out, and the world, consumed by the chaos of global war, mostly looked away. Meanwhile, Other parts of the Ottoman Empire were erupting into conflict. In the West, British and French strategists looked for ways to knock the Ottomans out of the war. Quickly. One idea was to attack the Dardanelles and take control of the Straits. If successful, it would open a supply route to Russia and put direct pressure on Istanbul. The result was the Gallipoli campaign, a major amphibious assault by Allied forces in 1915. British, French, Australian and New Zealand troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, expecting a quick victory. What they got was months of bloodshed. The Ottomans, under the leadership of military commander Mustafa Kemal, who would later become known as Ataturk, dug in and fought fiercely. The terrain was steep and rocky. The Allies struggled to advance. Supplies were limited. Disease spread. The campaign turned into a brutal stalemate, eerily similar to the Western Front. After nearly a year of fighting and over 250,000 casualties on each side, the Allies gave up and withdrew. Gallipoli became a symbol of both heroic resistance and military failure. For the Ottomans, it was a rare and vital victory, a sign that they could still defend their homeland. But the war didn't stop there. The Middle East became a vast, shifting battlefield. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, British forces invaded Ottoman territory to secure oil supplies and protect trade routes to India. At first, the British advanced quickly, taking key towns and pushing toward Baghdad. But they overextended. In 1916, an entire British Indian army was surrounded and forced to surrender at the town of Kut. It was one of the worst defeats the British suffered in the war. The Ottomans held strong, but like everywhere else, their victories came at a terrible cost. And as the war dragged on, cracks began to appear. The Ottoman Empire was fighting on too many fronts, with too few resources. Its economy was collapsing. Food shortages were rampant. Disease and famine spread across cities and countryside alike. The army was stretched thin. Supplies couldn't reach distant areas. And in the deserts of Arabia, something unexpected was stirring. The British, hoping to weaken the Ottomans from within, began supporting Arab nationalist movements. Many Arab leaders had grown resentful of Ottoman rule, especially as Turkish officials tried to centralize power. The British promised independence in exchange for rebellion. With British weapons, gold, and the help of officers like T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, Arab fighters launched guerrilla attacks against Ottoman garrisons and railways. It wasn't a large army, but it created chaos, forced the Ottomans to divert troops and undermined their control in key regions. Back in Istanbul, the government held on. But the costs were unbearable. Hundreds of thousands had died. The countryside was devastated. Many parts of the empire were under foreign occupation or in open rebellion. Yet still, the Ottomans kept fighting. They had thrown their lot in with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they were in too deep to pull out now. By 1917, things were falling apart. The British retook Kut and marched into Baghdad. In Palestine, they advanced steadily north, pushing Ottoman forces back. In the Arabian Peninsula, rebel fighters seized cities and disrupted supply lines. One by one, Ottoman territories slipped away. The empire was bleeding out. Then, in 1918, everything unraveled. Germany was on the brink of collapse. Austria-Hungary was falling apart. And the Ottomans, exhausted and broken, finally gave in. In October 1918, they signed an armistice with the Allies. The war was over, for them at least, but the peace would be just as painful as the war itself. After the armistice, Allied forces occupied parts of the empire. The once great Ottoman realm was divided by foreign powers. The British and French carved up the Middle East, drawing new borders with little regard for history, culture, or identity. The promises made to Arab leaders were broken. Tensions simmered, revolts flared up. And a young Turkish nationalist movement, led again by Mustafa Kemal, would soon rise to resist foreign control. For the Ottoman Empire, World War I was the final blow. It didn't just lose territory, it ceased to exist. In its place, new nations would rise, borders would be redrawn, and a century of conflict in the Middle East would begin. The war had turned the region into a battlefield, but the real consequences were only just beginning. The Ottoman decision to enter the war had seemed like a bold move for survival and restoration, but by the end, it had destroyed the very thing it aimed to save. The Middle East was forever changed, and the legacy of that decision would echo long after the last shot was fired. Chapter 12. Gallipoli. The Allies failed. By early 1915, the war had already bogged down into a brutal and bloody stalemate. On the Western Front, soldiers were digging deep into trenches, neither side making any real progress. The Eastern Front was massive and chaotic, and the Ottoman Empire had now joined the war, opening up new fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. But despite all the movement, the war was stuck. The Allies, mainly Britain, France and Russia, wanted a way to break the deadlock. They needed a bold move, something that could knock one of the Central Powers out of the war and shift the balance. That's when the idea of Gallipoli was born. The plan started with a simple goal: to open up a new front by attacking the Ottoman Empire from the south. By capturing the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow strip of water that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, the Allies hoped to open a supply route to Russia, which was running low on weapons and ammunition. More than that, they believed a successful attack could knock the Ottomans out of the war entirely. It sounded ambitious, but it also seemed doable. The Ottomans had already shown signs of weakness, especially after the disaster at Sarikamish. Allied leaders believed that with a strong naval assault and a quick land invasion, they could take the straits, march toward the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, and force a surrender. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, at the time was one of the biggest supporters of the plan. He pushed hard for a naval assault on the Dardanelles, convinced that a show of power from the sea could break through Ottoman defenses. In February 1915, the British and French navies began bombarding Ottoman forts along the straits. At first, the operation seemed promising. The initial bombardments damaged some forts and pushed back Ottoman gunners. But the deeper the Allied ships moved into the straits, the more problems they encountered. The Ottomans had laid mines in the water, and their coastal defenses were stronger than expected. On March 18th, a major assault by Allied warships ended in disaster. Several battleships were sunk or badly damaged by mines and artillery. The naval-only strategy had failed. It became clear that a land invasion would be needed if the Allies wanted to take control of the Dardanelles. So the plan changed. Instead of relying solely on ships, the Allies decided to land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which formed the northern bank of the strait. If they could secure the peninsula, they could silence the Ottoman guns and allow their navy to pass through. The idea sounded logical on paper, but in practice, it turned into one of the most tragic and poorly executed campaigns of the entire war. On April 25, 1915, thousands of Allied troops began landing on the shores of Gallipoli. The main landings happened in several locations, including Cape Helles at the southern tip and a narrow beach later known as Anzac Cove. The soldiers came from all over the British Empire: British troops, French colonial forces, Indian regiments, and the newly formed Anzacs, which stood for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. For many of them, this was their first experience of combat. They had trained for months and were told that the Ottomans would be weak and disorganized. But the reality was very different. The Ottomans were ready. They had been watching the Allied preparations and had dug in along the cliffs and ridges. Under the leadership of commanders like Mustafa Kemal, who would later become the founding father of modern Turkey, they prepared strong defensive positions. When the Allied troops came ashore, they faced steep terrain, machine gun fire from above, and chaotic landings. The beaches were narrow, exposed, and offered little cover. Many soldiers didn't even make it off the boats. What was supposed to be a swift and decisive strike turned into a nightmare. The fighting quickly settled into the same grim pattern as the Western Front. Trenches were dug. Soldiers faced constant shelling, sniper fire, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. The terrain was rocky and dry in summer, freezing and muddy in winter. Supplies were scarce. Clean water was limited. Flies, lice, and disease made life in the trenches miserable. The heat brought clouds of insects and the stench of unburied bodies. The cold brought frostbite and pneumonia. Soldiers suffered, and thousands died not just from bullets and bombs, but from infections and exhaustion. The Allies had completely underestimated the Ottomans' ability to resist. Every attempt to advance met with fierce counterattacks. Even small gains came at a huge cost. The high ground, especially key ridges and hills like Çanakkale and Acıbaba, remained in Ottoman hands, giving them a constant advantage. For months, the two sides traded fire, but made almost no real progress. It was trench warfare once, again in a different setting. One of the most infamous moments came in August 1915, during a large Allied offensive meant to break the stalemate. The plan was to attack multiple points at once and finally seize the ridges. The fighting was intense, especially around a place called Lone Pine, where Australian troops captured Ottoman trenches after days of close combat. But the broader offensive failed. The Ottomans held on. Thousands of men died for only a few hundred yards of ground. It became clear the Allies weren't going to win. As the months dragged on, morale collapsed. Troops who had arrived full of energy now spent their days in fear and misery. Commanders rotated in and out, strategies shifted constantly, but the situation didn't change. Supplies ran dangerously low. Winter arrived, bringing rain, snow, and flooding. Trenches filled with water, soldiers froze in their boots. Still, no breakthrough came. By December 1915, after 8 long months of fighting, Allied leaders made the painful decision to evacuate. The campaign had failed. Quietly and carefully, they began pulling troops off the peninsula. To their surprise, the evacuation itself went smoothly, perhaps the only part of the entire campaign that worked as planned. By January 1916, the last Allied troops had left Gallipoli. The operation was over. The cost was staggering. More than 250,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. The Ottoman losses were just as high. For every foot of ground gained or lost, thousands had paid with their lives. And yet the front line barely moved. Gallipoli had achieved none of its goals. The Dardanelles remained under Ottoman control. The supply route to Russia stayed blocked. And the idea of knocking the Ottomans out of the war was gone. For the Allies, Gallipoli was a humiliation. It exposed poor planning, underestimation of the enemy, and the terrible cost of overconfidence. Winston Churchill, who had championed the campaign, was forced to resign from his post. Many questioned how such a failure could happen and how so many lives had been thrown away for so little gain. But for the Ottoman Empire, it was something different. Gallipoli was a rare moment of triumph. Against all odds, they had defended their homeland. The victory gave them a morale boost at a time when their empire was otherwise crumbling. It also launched the rise of Mustafa Kemal, whose leadership during the campaign made him a national hero and set the stage for his future role as the leader of modern Turkey. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a defining national moment. Though the campaign had failed, the courage and sacrifice of the Anzac soldiers became a source of pride. April 25th, the day of the landing, became Anzac Day, a national day of remembrance. The campaign marked the beginning of a growing national identity, separate from the British Empire. It was a painful beginning, but it mattered deeply. In the broader story of the war, Gallipoli stands as a tragic example of how strategy, ambition, and human lives can collide. It was a desperate attempt to change the course of a global conflict. But instead of a breakthrough, it delivered only loss and suffering. It showed that even in new places, with new tactics and different terrain, the war still followed the same brutal rules. Plans could go wrong, soldiers would die in droves, and the front lines would stay stubbornly still. As the Allies licked their wounds and regrouped elsewhere, the war dragged on. The Western Front remained locked in its slow grind. The Eastern Front was falling apart. The Middle East would continue to burn with revolt and invasion. And in Gallipoli, the ghosts of 1915 would linger long after the guns fell silent. Chapter 13, War at Sea, Blockades and Submarines. As the echoes of artillery faded from the rocky shores of Gallipoli, the war's brutal logic continued elsewhere. On land, battles dragged on across Europe and beyond, but another front, less visible yet deeply powerful, was unfolding across the oceans. The war at sea was not defined by trenches or territory, but by control over trade, supplies, and the invisible arteries that kept nations alive. It wasn't just soldiers at the front lines who depended on these sea routes. Entire economies, civilians, and armies waited anxiously for the ships that brought food, fuel, weapons, and medicine. And during World War I, the seas became battlegrounds, just as deadly as the fields of France or the deserts of the Middle East. At the heart of this naval conflict were two major strategies: the British blockade and Germany's use of submarines. Both sides understood that starving the enemy of resources could be just as effective as defeating them in battle. If you couldn't get bullets to the front or bread to your people, you couldn't win a war. So ships, big and small, military and civilian, suddenly became high-stakes targets in a global struggle for survival. Britain, with its powerful Royal Navy, had long dominated the oceans. From the start of the war, the British focused on using this strength to blockade Germany. That meant surrounding German ports, stopping merchant ships, and cutting off access to the raw materials Germany needed. Coal, iron, oil, nitrates for explosives, rubber, these weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Without them, German factories would go silent, soldiers would go hungry, and the war effort would crumble from the inside. The blockade wasn't just a few ships floating near Germany. It was massive and far-reaching. British warships patrolled the North Sea, inspected cargo from neutral countries, and intercepted anything that could potentially support Germany. It was slow, methodical, and over time brutally effective. German imports dropped dramatically. Civilian shortages began to bite. The economy strained under pressure. By 1916 and 1917, people in German cities were beginning to suffer from real hunger, shortages, and cold winters with little fuel, but blockades cut both ways. Germany couldn't match the Royal Navy ship for ship on the surface. Their fleet was modern, but much smaller. Instead, they turned to a different kind of weapon, one that didn't rely on massive guns or towering steel hulls. They used submarines, called U-boats, short for Unterseeboot or undersea boat. These machines were silent, hunters, able to lurk below the surface and strike without warning. And while they were small and vulnerable, they were deadly. In the early months of the war, U-boat attacks were limited and cautious. But as the British blockade tightened, Germany grew desperate to strike back. Submarines began targeting merchant ships bringing supplies to Britain and France. The goal was clear. If they could sink enough cargo ships, they could starve the Allies just as the British were trying to starve them. Submarine warfare was terrifying. Merchant ships often didn't stand a chance. U-boats would surface, fire, a torpedo, and disappear again. There was no warning, no time to escape. Ships vanished beneath the waves in minutes, dragging cargo and crew down with them. At first, Germany tried to follow certain rules, like giving crews time to abandon ship. But these rules quickly faded as the war dragged on and the stakes rose. One of the most infamous moments came in 1915, when a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner Lusitania. The ship was carrying civilians, including women and children, as well as war supplies. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. The attack sent shockwaves across the world. Germany argued that the ship had been carrying military cargo, and they weren't wrong. But the loss of civilian lives was a PR disaster. It outraged public opinion, especially in the United States. For a time, Germany backed off from unrestricted submarine warfare, afraid of pushing neutral countries like America into the war. But the pause didn't last. By 1917, Germany was running out of options. The British blockade was strangling them, and the war on land was going nowhere. In desperation, they made a risky decision. They resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. That meant sinking any ship, military or civilian, allied or neutral, without warning, if it was headed to or from Britain. They knew it might provoke the United States, but they believed they could sink enough ships, fast enough, to break Britain, before America could enter the war and make a difference. So the U-boats launched their most intense campaign yet. They roamed the Atlantic, the English Channel, and the Mediterranean, hunting merchant convoys and patrol vessels. In early 1917 alone, hundreds of ships were sunk. The losses were staggering. Supplies began running dangerously low in Britain. There were fears of famine, of collapse. It seemed for a moment like the German strategy might actually work, but the Allies adapted. One of the most important changes was the introduction of convoys, groups of merchant ships escorted by military vessels. By traveling together, protected by destroyers and armed ships, the odds of surviving a U-boat attack improved dramatically. Submarines, after all, were fragile. If they were spotted, they could be forced to dive or even destroyed. The convoy system didn't stop all attacks, but it cut losses significantly. Combined with better technology, like sonar, depth charges, and aircraft patrols, the Allies slowly began to turn the tide. Still, the cost was enormous. Thousands of sailors, both military and civilian, lost their lives at sea. Crews sailed, knowing they might never reach land again. Merchant mariners became frontline soldiers in their own right, braving torpedoes and icy waters to keep their countries alive. The war at sea was not about glory, it was about endurance. Every ship that arrived safely meant another week of food, another load of ammunition, another breath of hope, and the impact went beyond Europe. This was a global war, and the oceans connected all of it. Ships from India, Canada, Australia, and Africa carried men and materials. Colonial troops arrived by sea. Oil from the Middle East, rubber from Southeast Asia, grain from the Americas, all of it flowed through these ocean routes. When ships were sunk, the damage wasn't just to the cargo. It disrupted entire economies. Insurance prices soared, trade routes shifted, ports slowed down. The war's ripple effects reached everywhere, and the sea was the main highway. The German gamble, unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare, ultimately backfired. In April 1917, just a few months after the policy was resumed, the United States declared war on Germany. The U-boat attacks, combined with other diplomatic missteps like the Zimmermann telegram, pushed America into the conflict. And with America came fresh troops, massive industrial power, and the potential to break the stalemate that had defined the war for years. In the end, the war at sea didn't end with one massive naval battle. There was no Trafalgar or Midway. Instead, it was a grinding, invisible struggle that wore both sides down. The British blockade had succeeded in choking Germany's economy. German civilians suffered through what became known as the turnip winter, when real food was so scarce that turnips replaced bread and meat in many households. Malnutrition, inflation, and unrest grew. On the Allied side, the convoy system and American support helped ensure that Britain and France didn't collapse first. The seas had decided nothing outright, but they had quietly shaped the fate of millions. When people think of World War I, they often picture the trenches of the Western Front, the mud of Flanders, the charge at Gallipoli, or the vastness of the Eastern battles. But the war was also fought in silence and salt water, in the steel hulls of ships and the cold depths where submarines waited. It was a war where shipping lanes mattered as much as front lines, a war where a single torpedo could have political consequences. A war where hunger, isolation, and supply were weapons as real as guns and gas. And as the war dragged on toward its final years, the battle for the seas continued, not always visible, not always remembered, but vital to the outcome. The oceans had become a theater of war, one where the fate of nations depended on whether ships could keep moving through water, darkened by danger. Chapter 14. The Air War. The Rise of the Fighter Pilot. At first, the airplane seemed like just another tool in the war, a fascinating invention, yes, but not something that could shape the course of a conflict. When World War I began, planes were used primarily for one simple task: watching. Pilots would fly above the battlefield and report back what they saw: enemy troop positions, movements, supply lines. It was a bird's-eye view that generals had never had before. Suddenly, armies could see beyond the horizon. But no one in those early days imagined what the skies would soon become. A new battlefield, brutal and intimate, where men dueled in thin air, alone in the clouds, armed with only a machine gun, a shaky engine, and nerves of steel. At first, reconnaissance flights were mostly unopposed. Pilots from both sides flew relatively safely, waving to one another when they passed. But this strange civility didn't last. The information those planes brought back was too valuable. The enemy had to be stopped from gathering it. And just like that, the age of the fighter pilot began. Not as a grand strategy, but as a desperate improvisation. Pilots started bringing pistols or rifles up with them to shoot at enemy planes. It was crude and largely ineffective. Try aiming a pistol at another plane while flying at high speed in the open air. It was almost impossible. Then came the next step, mounting machine guns on planes. But even that wasn't as easy as it sounds. Early planes were usually biplanes, two. Wings stacked one above the other, and their propellers spun directly in front of the pilot. Firing a machine gun straight ahead meant shooting right through the propeller. Not exactly a good idea. For a while, engineers tried to get around the problem by mounting guns on the upper wing or having a second person, the observer, man A, gun in the back of the plane. But that still left the pilot with limited firing control. The breakthrough came with a deadly innovation called the synchronization gear. It allowed a machine gun to fire through the spinning propeller without hitting the blades by carefully timing the shots to the rotation. It sounds like madness, but it worked, and it changed everything. Now for the first time, a single pilot could fly and fire in the same direction. Planes became hunters. And in the skies over Europe, a new kind of warrior was born. Dogfighting. Fast. Deadly aerial combat became a daily part of life over the trenches. The planes were small, light, and incredibly fragile, made mostly of wood and canvas. A single bullet in the right place could tear a wing or ignite the fuel tank. There were no parachutes. If your plane caught fire or broke apart in the sky, that was the end. Still young men lined up to be fighter pilots. It was dangerous, sure, but it was also a chance to escape the mud, the rats, and the misery of the trenches. In the cockpit, you weren't one of many. You were a lone warrior, a knight of the sky. Many of these pilots were barely out of school. They were daring, ambitious, and eager to prove themselves. The public admired them. Newspapers wrote about them as heroes, giving them nicknames and turning them into legends. None more so than the German pilot Manfred von Richthofen, better, known as the Red Baron. Flying his bright red Fokker triplane, he claimed 80 confirmed kills, 80 enemy planes shot down. He was calm, precise, and ruthlessly effective. The Allies feared him. His name became a symbol of air superiority, but he wasn't alone. The British had their own aces, like Albert Ball and Edward Manock. The French had René Fonck and Georges Guinemet. These men weren't just fighting battles, they were defining a new kind of warfare. In the air, everything was different. Unlike on the ground, there were no trenches, no cover, no hiding. You saw your enemy, and they saw you. You circled, climbed, dived, looped, and spun, each trying to get behind the other to fire the winning shot. These dogfights were fast and disorienting, like dances of death in the clouds. Pilots had to master their machines completely. A small mistake, a slip, a stall, a misjudged turn, meant death. It wasn't just about being brave. You had to be skilled, disciplined, and endlessly aware. Many pilots didn't survive long. Enough to learn. Life expectancy at the front for new pilots could be measured in weeks, but those who did survive, those who became aces, gained immense prestige. In a war defined by muddy stalemates and mass death, fighter pilots offered a rare image of individual valor. They wore scarves, painted their planes with symbols or personal colors, and became almost like celebrities. Some airmen kept diaries or wrote letters home describing their missions in detail, capturing the strange, lonely terror of flying in combat. They weren't machines. They were young men facing death in a way that was deeply personal. The planes themselves evolved quickly. At the start of the war, most planes could barely reach 80 miles per hour. By the end, they were faster, sturdier, and better armed. Engineers on both sides pushed aviation forward in a race to outbuild the enemy. New types of engines, stronger airframes, better guns, and improved maneuverability gave pilots more control and speed. Designs like the British Sopwith Camel or the German Albatross became legendary for their balance of power and agility. Each new model brought with it new tactics, new possibilities, and new risks. But the air war wasn't just about one-on-one dogfights. As time went on, it became more organized. Squadrons were formed, missions were coordinated, and planes were assigned to specific tasks. Some were scouts, some were fighters, and some, perhaps most dangerously, were bombers. These bombers flew over enemy lines, often at night, dropping explosives on supply depots.